Exiled Chinese cook paid $5 for a room. The quilt on the bed made him freeze in place. The coins felt heavy in Chen Wei's palm, heavier than they should have been. $5 silver. All that remained of 3 months' work in the kitchens of the Lucky Strike saloon, scraping plates and washing glasses until his hands cracked like old bark. The wind pushed against his back as he stood before the weathered sign that read, Hutchins Boarding House. Clean rooms, fair prices. The paint was peeling, and the wood groaned with each gust, but it promised a roof and 4 walls. In Deadwood, that was more than most could ask for. The woman who answered his knock was older than the mountains, her face carved by years of prairie sun and bitter winters. She looked him up and down without judgment, taking in his worn coat and the careful way he held himself, like a man trying to make himself smaller in a world that had already decided he took up too much space. $5, she said simply, extending a weathered hand. That'll get you a room for the week. Heat costs extra, but there's blankets. Chen counted the coins into her palm, watching his last bit of security disappear into the folds of her apron. She led him upstairs that creaked with the weight of too many years and too many strangers seeking shelter. The hallway smelled of old wood and the ghosts of 1,000 meals cooked in rooms where people tried to make homes out of nothing. Room 12, she said, pressing a key into his hand. It was warm from being kept in her pocket. Privy's out back. No drinking, no fighting, no bringing trouble to my door. Chen nodded, though he wondered what trouble a man like him could possibly bring. He was 43 years old and felt like 70. His trouble was already behind him, burned to ash in a fire that took everything he had ever loved. The door opened to a space barely large enough for a single bed, a washstand, and a chair that had seen better decades. The window looked out onto the alley where snow was beginning to fall, each flake disappearing the moment it touched the muddy ground. The walls were bare wood, stained dark with age and moisture, and the air held the chill of a room that had never quite learned to be warm. But it was the quilt that made him freeze. It lay folded at the foot of the narrow bed, and at first glance it seemed like nothing special, just another piece of fabric meant to keep the cold at bay. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the dusty window, Chen saw the pattern. Squares of faded blue silk bordered by strips of yellow cotton, arranged in a design that made his chest tighten with recognition. His legs gave out, and he found himself sitting hard on the bed, the wooden frame groaning under his weight. With trembling hands, he reached for the quilt, unfolding it slowly, as if it might crumble at his touch. The fabric was soft from years of use, the edges worn thin, but the stitching was unmistakable. Small, precise stitches made by hands that had learned patience from necessity, beauty from scraps. The pattern was called wedding ring in English, but Chen knew it by another name. Mei Lin had called it eternal circle, when she worked on it by lamplight in their small house by the railroad tracks. She would hum softly while she sewed, a melody from her childhood in Guangdong, her fingers moving with the rhythm of memory. Each evening after his shift at the mine, Chen would find her there, adding another piece to the growing quilt that was meant to warm their bed for 50 years. He had watched her choose each scrap of fabric with the care of a woman selecting jewels. The blue silk came from the dress she wore when they married, the only fine thing she owned. The yellow cotton was from his work shirts, the ones she would mend over and over until they were more patched than original cloth. She saved every piece, every thread, knowing that nothing should be wasted when you had so little to begin with. For our children, she would say, smoothing the finished sections with her palm. They will know their parents were poor, but they will also know we were rich in love. But there were no children. The fever took their first baby before he could draw breath, and something in Mei Lin broke that day. She kept sewing, but her hums grew quieter, then stopped altogether. Still, she worked on the quilt, as if finishing it might somehow bring back what they had lost. Chen ran his fingers along the familiar stitches, remembering the weight of her head on his shoulder as she slept, exhausted from her work. He remembered the way the lamplight caught the silver in her black hair, how young she looked when she dreamed. He remembered promising her that they would have enough money someday to fill a real house with real furniture, that the quilt would cover a bed in a room with windows that looked out on something beautiful. The fire had come on a Tuesday night in October. It started in the dry goods store and spread like a hungry animal through Chinatown, eating everything in its path. Chen had been working late at the restaurant, and by the time he smelled smoke, it was already too late. He ran through streets filled with ash and screaming, but their house was gone, swallowed by flames that reached toward the stars like grasping fingers. He found Mei Lin's body in what had been their bedroom, curled around the wooden box where she kept her sewing supplies. The quilt was nowhere to be found. He assumed it had burned with everything else: their clothes, their furniture, their letters from home, their future. But here it was, impossibly, in a boarding house room that cost $5 and smelled of other people's loneliness. Here was the proof that love had once existed in his life, that he had not dreamed the gentle woman who hummed while she sewed circles of silk and cotton into something beautiful. Chen pressed the quilt to his face, breathing in the scent of sage and dust and something that might have been her skin, though he knew that was impossible. The fabric held no memory of her touch, only the echo of her labor, the ghost of her hope that they would grow old together beneath this cover she had made with her own hands. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, and the wind rattled the window in its frame. Chen wrapped the quilt around his shoulders and felt, for the first time in months, something that might have been warmth. But it came with a weight that settled in his chest like a stone. How had it survived when she had not? How had this piece of their life together found its way into the hands of strangers, been folded and stored and forgotten, only to wait for him in a room he could barely afford? The questions had no answers, only the endless ache of missing someone who would never again sit beside him in the lamplight, never again choose scraps of beauty from the remnants of their simple life. The last light of day faded from the window, and Chen sat in the growing darkness, wrapped in memory and cotton, wondering if some gifts were too precious to accept, and others too precious to refuse. Sleep would not come. Chen sat on the edge of the narrow bed as the hours crawled by, the quilt spread across his lap like a map of a country he could never visit again. Each square told a story his heart knew by memory, but his mind struggled to accept. In the pale light of the oil lamp he had lit with his last match, the fabric seemed to glow with its own warmth, as if Mei Lin's hands still moved beneath the surface, still guided the needle through silk and cotton. He traced the border with one finger, following the path she had sewn with such care. Here was the corner where she had started, the stitches slightly uneven because her hands were still learning the rhythm. She was 18 then, newly married, still shy about the way he watched her work. Her tongue would peek out between her lips when she concentrated, and she would blush when she caught him staring. "I am not beautiful when I sew," she would protest, but Chen knew better. She was most beautiful then, when she thought no one was watching, when her face held the peace of a woman creating something lasting from scraps of the temporary. The yellow cotton came from his work shirts. He could see the faint stains that even Mei Lin's careful washing could not remove. Red clay from the mine, dark spots that might have been machine oil, the salt rings left by his sweat during the long summer when the heat underground made breathing feel like drowning. She had cut around the worst of the damage, but she saved every usable piece. Waste nothing. Her mother had taught her, and Mei Lin carried that lesson from the old country into their new life. Every thread had purpose, every scrap held possibility. When his shirts grew too thin to mend, she would cut them into strips and squares, sorting them by color and weight into the wooden box that held her sewing supplies. Chen remembered the box now, carved from sandalwood by her father before they left Guangdong. It smelled like home, like incense and her mother's cooking, like the garden where she learned to embroider flowers that looked real enough to pick. Inside, she kept needles wrapped in silk, spools of thread arranged by color, and a small pair of scissors that had belonged to her grandmother. The scissors were the finest thing they owned. The handles were silver, delicate as bird bones, and they cut with the precision of a blade that had never known rough work. Mei Lin would clean them after every use, wrapping them carefully in a piece of red cloth before returning them to their place in the box. She said her grandmother's spirit lived in those scissors, guiding her hands to make cuts that honored the fabric instead of wasting it. The fire had taken the box, the scissors, and the woman who cherished them. But somehow, impossibly, it had spared this quilt. This piece of their life that she had poured 3 years of evenings into, stitch by careful stitch. Chen found the square made from her wedding dress, the blue silk now faded, but still holding the memory of that day. She had worn it only once, standing beside him in the small church in Sacramento where the Chinese families gathered for ceremonies the white minister barely understood. Her hands shook as she spoke the English words they had practiced, but her eyes never left his face. After the ceremony, she folded the dress carefully and placed it in the chest at the foot of their bed. For special occasions, she said, but special occasions never came. They were too poor for parties, too tired for celebrations. The dress waited in the darkness while they worked to build a life that felt secure enough for joy. When she began the quilt, Chen protested the sacrifice. "Keep the dress," he said. "Maybe our daughter will wear it someday." But Mei Lin shook her head, already reaching for the scissors. "A dress hangs in a chest and serves no one," she said. "But this will keep us warm for 50 years. Which is the better use?" She was practical like that, his Mei Lin. She measured life in usefulness, in service, in the small ways people care for each other when grand gestures are too expensive for their pockets. The quilt was her grand gesture, made from scraps and held together with devotion. Chen studied the stitching in the lamplight, remembering how she would sit beside him in the evenings, her needle flashing in and out of the fabric with a rhythm like breathing. She worked without patterns, trusting her eye to find the balance, her hands to make the curves smooth and even. Sometimes she would hum old songs her mother had sung, melodies that carried the weight of mountains and the promise of rain. "What does the song mean?" he asked her once, and she paused in her sewing to consider. "It is about a woman who plants a garden, but the seasons do not come as expected. Still, she tends her plants and sings to them, believing that love can change the weather." Mei Lin smiled and returned to her work. "My mother said it is about hope, but I think it is about stubbornness." The memory brought tears that Chen had not allowed himself to shed in the 6 months since her death. They came quietly, without the violence of grief that had torn through him in those first weeks. These tears were different, gentle, like rain on dust, like the last light of evening settling on the mountains. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the town settling into sleep. Somewhere in the boarding house, floorboards creaked under the weight of another restless soul. A dog barked in the distance, then fell silent. The wind pushed against the window with fingers that sounded almost like knocking, like someone seeking shelter from the storm. Chen pulled the quilt tighter around his shoulders and felt the strange comfort of being held by something his wife had made. It was not her arms, but it had known her touch. It was not her voice, but it carried her intentions. The hope that they would grow old together, that winter nights would find them safe and warm beneath this covering she had sewn from love and remnants. He found the section where she had struggled, where the pattern had gone slightly wrong and she had to adjust the design to hide her mistake. She had been upset that evening, crying over the imperfection until Chen took the needle from her hands and kissed her fingers. "Nothing beautiful is perfect," he told her. "The flaws are what make it real." Now, in the lamplight of a room that smelled of strangers and dust, Chen understood what he had not known then. The quilt was not beautiful despite its imperfections. It was beautiful because of them. Each uneven stitch was proof that human hands had made this thing, that love did not require perfection to create something lasting. The oil in the lamp burned low, the flame flickering like a pulse. Soon it would die, and he would be alone with the darkness and the questions that had no answers. How had the quilt survived? who had pulled it from the ashes of his life and kept it safe until this impossible moment when he needed it most. But even as he wondered, Chen felt something shift in his chest. Not the sharp pain of loss that had become his constant companion, but something softer, warmer. The quilt around his shoulders seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, reminding him that not everything burned, that some things endure even when the hands that made them are gone. In the growing darkness, wrapped in the work of his wife's hands, Chen began to believe that somewhere in this harsh town full of strangers, there might be someone who understood the value of preserving what others might discard as worthless. The knock came soft as a whisper, 3 gentle taps that pulled Chen from the half-sleep he had finally found as dawn broke gray and cold over Deadwood. He had dozed wrapped in the quilt, his back against the thin wall, his dreams full of Mei Lin's voice humming melodies he could almost remember. The sound at his door seemed part of those dreams until it came again, patient as rainfall. Chen rose slowly, his joints stiff from sleeping upright, and opened the door to find the boarding house owner standing in the dim hallway. But in the morning light she looked different than she had the night before. Smaller somehow, her gray hair braided and pinned with the care of a woman who still believed in the importance of appearing proper, even when no one was watching. Her hands were folded in front of her apron, and Chen noticed for the first time how the fingertips were marked with tiny punctures. The scars of someone who had spent a lifetime pushing needles through fabric. "I'm Sarah Hutchins," she said, though she had not given her name the night before. "I hope you slept well, mister?" "Chen," he said simply, not offering his family name. In a town like Deadwood, less information was usually safer, especially for a man who looked like him. "Mr. Chen." She nodded as if committing it to memory. "I wondered if I might have a word with you." "About the quilt." The words hit him like cold wind. Chen's hand tightened on the door frame, his chest suddenly tight with the fear of losing the one thing that connected him to what he had loved. "The quilt. I saw it last night when I brought your key," Sarah said, her voice gentle as if she understood his fear. "I recognized it because I made it. Or rather, I finished it. May I come in? I have tea, and this story is too long for doorways." Chen stepped back without a word, watching as this weathered woman entered his small room carrying a basket covered with a clean white cloth. She moved with the careful efficiency of someone accustomed to making do with little space, setting the basket on the single chair and removing a blue enamel pot that still steamed with warmth, 2 tin cups that had seen better years but were clean and whole, and a small cloth bag that smelled of mint and chamomile. "I live in room 7, just down the hall," she said, pouring tea into the cups with steady hands. "Been here 3 years now, since my husband passed. This building belongs to me, but I keep that information quiet. People treat you differently when they know you own the roof over their heads." She handed Chen a cup, and he wrapped his fingers around its warmth, grateful for something solid to hold. The tea was good, better than anything he had tasted in months, and it carried the comfort of someone who understood that small kindnesses could mean the difference between despair and hope. "Where did you find it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah settled herself on the edge of the bed, her own cup cradled in both hands. "In the ashes," she said simply, "after the fire that took Chinatown. I was there with the church ladies trying to help where we could. Most folks just stood and watched, but some of us felt called to do something useful." Chen remembered that night, the way the flames had lit the sky like a false sunrise, the way the wind had carried ash and ember through the streets like snow made of sorrow. He remembered running toward the fire instead of away from it, calling Mei Lin's name until his voice gave out, until the smoke filled his lungs and men stronger than him held him back from following her into the flames. "I found pieces of fabric scattered in what had been a house," Sarah continued, her eyes focused on something beyond the small window. "Blue silk, yellow cotton, scraps that had somehow survived when everything else burned. They were dirty, some singed at the edges, but the colors were so beautiful I couldn't bear to leave them there." She paused to sip her tea, and Chen saw that her hands trembled slightly. "I didn't know whose they were. I told myself I was just saving fabric from waste, that I could use the pieces for something practical. But when I got them home and washed them clean, I saw they had been cut with intention. Someone had planned to make something beautiful from these scraps. Chen felt tears building behind his eyes, but he kept them back. So you finished it. I tried to imagine what they might have become, Sarah said. The pieces seemed to want to be a wedding ring pattern, so I arranged them that way. It took me 2 months, working in the evenings after my other chores were done. I told myself I was just keeping busy, that idle hands make for troubled thoughts. She set down her cup and looked directly at Chen for the first time since entering the room. Her eyes were blue-gray, the color of winter sky, and they held a sadness he recognized as the twin of his own. But I knew I was really trying to honor whoever had cut those pieces with such care, she said. Someone had loved that fabric enough to save it, to plan something lasting with it. I couldn't let that intention die with them. Chen felt something break open in his chest. Not the sharp crack of fresh grief, but the gentler release of a breath held too long. Her name was Mei Lin, he said. She was my wife. Sarah's face softened with understanding that needed no explanation. She had seen enough loss in her 60-some years to recognize it in others, had felt enough sorrow to know when words would help and when silence served better. She had beautiful hands, Sarah said quietly. I could tell from the way the fabric was cut. Every piece was considered, nothing wasted. The person who planned this quilt understood the value of small things. She saved everything, Chen said, surprised by how good it felt to speak Mei Lin's name aloud, to have someone who wanted to hear about her. Buttons, thread, scraps of cloth that most people would burn. She said waste was a sin when so many had nothing. Wise woman, Sarah murmured. I wish I could have known her. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who understood that some conversations required pauses, spaces for the heart to catch up with the words. Outside, Deadwood was coming alive with the sounds of another day. Horses in the street, men calling to each other, the distant sound of hammering where someone was building something new on ground that had seen too much torn down. I kept hoping someone would come looking for it, Sarah said eventually. In those first weeks after the fire, I watched for anyone who might have lost family, anyone who seemed to be searching for something specific. But you never came to the church, never asked the ladies who were helping with relief efforts. Chen understood her unspoken question. I left town the day after the fire, he said. Took work at a lumber camp up north. I couldn't bear to see the place where our house had been, couldn't stand the pity in people's eyes. I only came back to Deadwood last week, when the winter shut down the camps. And you came here, to this room, where the quilt was waiting, Sarah said, wonder creeping into her voice. 3 years I've been putting it on this bed, hoping somehow it would find its way home. Chun looked at the quilt, still draped where he had left it on the bed's foot. In the gray morning light, it seemed to glow with its own warmth, each square a window into a love that had survived fire, loss, and the careless passage of time. I don't understand how you knew, he said, how you could take scattered pieces and put them back together exactly as she would have done it. Sarah smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her. Sometimes when you're broken yourself, you understand how broken things want to be whole again. I've spent 3 years mending other people's clothes, fixing tears and replacing buttons. But you learn to see what something is supposed to be, even when it's been torn apart. She reached out and touched the edge of the quilt with fingers that knew the weight of every stitch. Besides, she added softly, love leaves instructions in the cloth. If you're quiet enough to listen, the fabric tells you what it wants to become. In the growing light of morning, Chun began to understand that he had found more than shelter for $5. He had found someone who understood that the most important work happened in quiet moments, stitch by stitch, when the world wasn't watching and there was no promise of reward except the satisfaction of making something broken whole again. The days that followed their first conversation fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Each morning, Sarah would knock softly on Chen's door, not with words but with the gentle sound of work beginning, the rustle of fabric, the quiet scrape of her chair being positioned near the window where the light was best. Chen would find her there in the hallway, surrounded by baskets of mending that seemed to multiply overnight, her fingers already moving with the steady patience of someone who understood that healing happened one stitch at a time. "The whole town brings me their broken things," she said on the third morning, holding up a man's work shirt with a tear that ran from shoulder to hem. "They think because I'm a woman alone, I have nothing better to do than fix what they've torn." But Chen could see in the way she smoothed the fabric, the care with which she arranged her thread, that this work was more than mere necessity. It was her way of staying connected to the world when grief had made her want to disappear from it entirely. "I could help," he offered, surprising himself with the words. "I watched Mei Lin mend my clothes for 15 years. My hands remember some of what hers taught them." Sarah looked up from her work, her needle paused mid-stitch. "You would want to do women's work?" The question carried no judgment, only curiosity. In her tone, Chen heard the echo of his own wondering. How a man rebuilt his life when the person who gave it meaning was gone. How he found purpose when his purpose had been loving someone who no longer existed. "I want to do useful work," Chen said simply. "And I want to understand why the quilt found its way back to me." Sarah smiled, an expression that seemed to surprise her own face. "Then we'll start with something simple. Mrs. Fletcher's apron has a pocket that's coming loose. Nothing that can't be fixed with patience and good thread." She was right about the simplicity, but Chen found his fingers clumsy at first, unaccustomed to the delicate pressure needed to guide a needle through worn cotton without tearing it further. Mei Lin had made sewing look effortless, her hands moving with the fluid grace of water finding its way downhill. Chen's stitches were uneven, his tension inconsistent, but Sarah watched without criticism, occasionally adjusting his grip on the fabric or showing him how to anchor a knot so it wouldn't pull through. "Your wife taught you well," she said, watching him work. "You hold the needle like someone who understands it's a tool, not a weapon." As the morning progressed, Chen's hands began to remember what they had observed during those long evenings when he and Mei Lin sat together in lamplight, she with her quilting and he with the newspaper or a book borrowed from the mine foreman. He had not realized how much he had learned simply by watching, how the rhythm of her work had become part of the background music of their marriage. "Tell me about her," Sarah said as they worked. "About the woman who cut those pieces with such care." Chen found that the steady motion of mending made it easier to speak about Mei Lin, as if his hands needed something to do while his heart remembered. He told Sarah about the way Mei Lin would hum while she sewed, about her conviction that nothing should be wasted, about the small garden she had tried to grow behind their house despite the poor soil and harsh weather. "She planted vegetables but also flowers," he said, his needle catching the afternoon light as it moved through the fabric. "Practical things and beautiful things side by side." She said a person needed both to be fully alive. Sarah nodded, understanding passing between them without need for explanation. "My husband used to say something similar. He was a carpenter, and he would spend extra time on joints that no one would ever see, making them smooth and perfect because he said the wood deserved that kind of respect." They worked through the afternoon, and Chen discovered that there was comfort in the slow, meditative nature of mending. Each repair required attention, consideration of how the fabric wanted to be helped, patience with the process of making something broken whole again. It was work that could not be rushed, work that rewarded careful thought over quick action. "I have an idea," Sarah said as they finished Mrs. Fletcher's apron. "Something I've been thinking about since I found those pieces of your wife's fabric." She disappeared into her room and returned with a wooden box that Chen recognized as the type used to store sewing supplies. But when she opened it, instead of thread and needles, it held scraps of fabric in every color and texture imaginable. Silk and cotton, wool and linen. Pieces saved from a dozen different projects. "Every time I mend something, I save the scraps that get cut away," she said. "Good fabric that's too small for most uses, but too valuable to throw out. I've been thinking we could use them to make quilts for the boarding house. Covers for beds that have only thin blankets, warmth for people who can't afford to buy their own." Chen looked at the rainbow of fabric pieces, each one carrying the story of its original purpose. Here was a square of blue wool from a coat that had kept someone warm through mountain winters. There, a strip of yellow cotton from a dress that had danced at summer socials. Green flannel from a shirt that had worked in fields. Red silk from a dress that had celebrated special occasions. It would be like what you did with Mei Lin's pieces, he said, understanding dawning. Taking what was scattered and making it whole. Exactly. Sarah's eyes brightened with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a purpose worth pursuing. We could call them memory quilts, each one made from pieces of other people's lives, carrying their stories forward into something new. Chen felt something stir in his chest that he had not experienced in months. The spark of anticipation, the sense that tomorrow might hold something worth working toward. Mei Lin would have loved this idea, he said. She believed that useful beauty was the highest art. They spent the rest of the day sorting fabric, arranging pieces by color and weight, discussing patterns that would showcase the different textures while creating unified designs. Chen found himself drawing on memories of Mei Lin's methods, her eye for balance and proportion, her understanding of how colors could speak to each other across the boundaries of a quilt. We'll need to be careful about the stitching, he said, holding up a piece of delicate silk next to a square of sturdy canvas. Different fabrics pull differently. Mei Lin always said the secret was to let each piece be what it was while still being part of the whole. Sarah smiled, her hands already moving to begin the first arrangement. Your wife was wise. It sounds like she understood that the best quilts are like the best communities, made of different pieces that somehow create something stronger together. As evening approached and the light from the window began to fade, Chen and Sarah sat surrounded by piles of sorted fabric, each stack representing the beginning of a new quilt, a new story that would warm someone who needed it. The work ahead would be measured in months, not days. Careful cutting, patient stitching, attention to the details that would make each quilt worthy of the stories it carried. But for the first time since Mei Lin's death, Chen felt the particular satisfaction that comes from meaningful work, from labor that serves others while honoring what has been lost. In the growing darkness of the hallway, surrounded by the tools of mending and the promise of creation, he understood that love does not end with death. It transforms, finding new hands to do its work, new ways to warm the world one stitch at a time. The quilt that had brought him here was just the beginning, the first thread in a pattern that would connect broken things to healing, scattered pieces to wholeness, strangers to each other through the simple act of sharing warmth. And in that understanding, Chen felt Mei Lin's presence not as a ghost haunting his past, but as a guide pointing toward a future where her values could live on through his hands, his choices, his willingness to continue the work of creating beauty from remnants. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the boarding house, two people bent over their careful work, weaving hope from scraps, proving that even in a town built on the promise of gold, the real treasure had always been the human capacity to mend what was broken and share what little warmth we have with those who need it most. So that's the story for today. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. On a scale of 10 to 0, how would you rate this story? And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay happy and take care.